Welcome to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. We study change in order to make change, linking knowledge of the past to the quest for a better future. Every other week, we examine the most pressing issues of the day through a historical lens, helping us understand what happened then and what that means for us now.
Welcome to Then and Now, the podcast of the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. I'm David Myers, host of the podcast, which today will deal with the intersection of music, culture, and politics. The great jazz trumpeter Louis Armstrong once declared that, quote, music is life itself. It mirrors, reflects, and creates vital life forms. The contemporary rock icon Bruce Springsteen has stated that, quote, the best music is essentially there to provide you something to face the world with. And indeed, for many people and groups, music has been a form of expression, salvation, and resistance to face the world with. For example, music has been a constant companion and source of sustenance, creativity, and pain in African American history, from church spirituals to rap. To understand better the function of music and culture in politics, and especially the place of hip-hop in contemporary Black society and the global world, we're delighted to have on today's episode Dr. Samuel Lamontagne. Sam is a Chancellor's postdoctoral fellow in the Department of History and the Ralph Bunche Center for African American Studies at UCLA. His research focuses on hip-hop and electronic dance music in Los Angeles, in Paris, and in the African diaspora more generally. He has published a book on electronic music and numerous articles in national and international publications. He's the former co-editor-in-chief of the journal Ethnomusicology Review, and he co-leads, along with H. Sami Alim and Tabia Shawel, the UCLA Hip Hop Initiative. Beyond his academic work, he's been involved in Los Angeles and Paris musical communities for the past decade, notably through We Love Lamert, Dub Lab Radio, and the Pan-African People's Orchestra. Welcome to Then and Now, Dr. Samuel Lamontagne.
Thank you, David, for having me. I'm very excited for this conversation.
So let's begin at the beginning, and maybe you could just tell us what initially drew you to the study of music, and what kind of music did you listen to when you were growing up?
So for me, it all started from a love of music and a passion for music. So I come from a pretty musical family with musicians, but also just music lovers. And so music was always a big part of my life. And in the 1980s, my mom was a dancer in Paris, in close proximity to the emerging hip hop scene at the time. And so when I was growing up, she was, playing a lot of rap music. And, we were, since she was a dancer, we danced a lot in our home on the music. So dance was always a part of it too. And so she played a lot of rap, both French and US, Public Enemy, De La Soul, Alliance Ethnique, Ministère Amer, and also R&B and funk and zouk. And then my dad is a little bit older. He's a saxophone player. So he's more of a jazz cat and also plays, funk and soul. And my family is from the West Indies, so Guadeloupe and Martinique. So, also that plays a big part because the music is a very important part of the culture. So yeah, just, really music being a big part of my life, and then getting older and getting into music on my own, started listening to rap on my own and starting a hip hop practice on my own too. And then after I graduated high school, I started university, and in France, university is free, so it's a little bit different. You can kind of figure things out while you go to university. And so I was studying anthropology, and I realized that with anthropology, you can kind of study whatever you want. So naturally, I kind of gravitated towards studying music and studying hip hop because it was like my passion, and also because of the way it's connected to Blackness and across the diaspora.
So I want to go back to an earlier period before you made your way to university. you mentioned musical traditions that were emerging from the United States, and mentioned musical traditions that were coming out of France, and then in the larger African diaspora. Did you have a sense as a kid of distinct sort of origin points of these musical traditions? Rap coming out of the United States, or jazz, hip hop, funk coming from the United States, as opposed to discrete French or African lineages? Or did it sort of all fuse into one as a young kid for you?
Right. I think as a young kid, I think it was all fused into one, just category of Black music or just Blackness, especially in France. I grew up in the 90s, so it's a time when it's a little bit different now, but in the 90s, in France was a time where race and Blackness was pretty invisible in terms of French Black people. So in terms of the representations that we were getting of Blackness, a lot of it came from the United States. So in that sense, for example, in terms of, Black heroes, I knew about Martin Luther King and Malcolm X before I knew about Aimé Césaire or Frantz Fanon or Léopold Senghor, etc.
Is that right?
Yeah. Because in France, because it's a colorblind country, the whole different Black histories from different parts of the world that Black French people are coming from is just not. Well, it's a little bit better now, but in the 90s was completely invisible. So the only, at least in the media, Black representations that we would get would be mostly from the United States, and then our own cultures, West Indian culture, from Guadeloupe, Martinique, or Africa, would be more like community. Something that I would get from my family, and but that wasn't, or my community, but that wasn't as mediated and as visible in the public space as African American or Black American culture was.
Right. You're talking about the distinctive homogenizing effects of what the French called laïcité, the sort of the ideal of the great French Republic that is home to all who are equal in it. Of course, fitting a classically white Christian ideal. And so I wonder, when did you begin to differentiate musical traditions? And for that matter, when did you begin to understand, that there were distinct Black political and cultural lineages to which you were connected? And then sort of the third and most important piece is, when did you put it all together? What was that, when you were studying anthropology in France, or did you have to take leave of France to come to the United States to sort of begin to understand how music reflects and contributes to culture, and how political music is, which is where I would love to go.
Right. I think in terms of how everything came together, it's hard to say. I think I'm still figuring out how it's still coming together. I'm still learning about, even if those different musical cultures are different, coming from different places, they're also very much connected. Just even thinking about hip hop in the context of New York and how it came about in the 70s. It's really coming from an interaction between African Americans, but also interaction with Afro-Caribbeans from Jamaica, Grenada, Trinidad, and not only in the 70s, but also even going back further, because New York had been a Caribbean mecca for a long time. It's not for nothing that Marcus Garvey created his organization in New York. It's because New York was already a Caribbean mecca. So hip hop, even though it came up in New York in the 70s, was already global. It was already grounded in this Pan-African, global Black cultural interactions. But I think in terms of thinking about music between, at the intersection of culture, politics, and aesthetics, I think it really comes from a personal space for me too, because, like I was saying, I grew up, with a hip hop practice. So, and especially growing up in France, which is, quote unquote, colorblind country, which really means that it's a country that is in denial of its colonial past and its legacies in the contemporary. So a country where whiteness is the implicit norm, hip hop created a space for Blackness to be articulated in its whole complexity and diversity. So being involved in hip hop and practicing hip hop, I was already engaging in cultural and political aspects of hip hop probably before I was even aware of it, fully aware of it.
Can you say a bit more about your practice then?
Yeah, at first I was just, having fun, rapping and dancing. And then I took it more seriously when I was a teenager. So yeah, just rapping and making beats. And later on, I'm still DJ. I stopped rapping probably for the better, but I'm still DJing. I'm still collecting records, and just the whole practice of hip hop in itself, in DJing is just, a practice, a practical way of learning about music, collecting records. It's not just buying records. It's a way to learn about music and going deeper in the knowledge of music through records and playing records.
And I'm just intrigued by that formative period for you. Did you imagine your own hip hop practice as a project of resistance to this very white ideal of France, this sort of enforced equality? And in a certain sense, does your subsequent scholarly inquiry really emerge out of that intersection of music and politics?
At first it was just like really fun and something beautiful that I wanted to be involved in. But it was always connected to Blackness, and that was part of what made it beautiful too, because in France, when I was growing up, I think hip hop was really the only cultural space that at least was available to me where I could do something that was, beautiful and that was fun, that was connected to Blackness, and that was providing a space for me and my friends to articulate, our Blackness or our identity, but also our experiences. And I think, thinking about Black music in general in the West, those three, so aesthetics, culture, and politics is kind of inseparable, because you have, on one hand, you have aesthetics, right? So style and beauty and the fun and the pleasure that we get from it. But it's also culture, because it's not just art. It's, it's forms of expertise that are connected to cultural practices that take and produce particular meanings in people's lives. And then it's politics, because that culture happens in a society that is marked by power dynamics involving race, sexuality, class, gender, generation. So that hip hop culture is both shaped by society at the same time as it's a reflection on it. And so hip hop culture, as it is producing knowledge and producing meaning, is not only involved in the reproduction of, systems of power, like Foucault would say, but as a cultural practice is involved in the production of knowledge. So it's also a cultural practice that is a critical tool and a reimaginative tool. And I think that we have to think about hip hop at the intersection of aesthetics, culture, and politics. And to, refer to Robin D.G. Kelley, his book, Freedom Dreams, the Black Radical Imaginations, he talks about how Black culture and Black artistic practices across history and across the diaspora have continuously been involved in not just refusing anti-Black defined worlds, but also in imagining new ones.
And thinking of that, I'm curious if you can give us a bit of a understanding of the hip-hop scene in Paris. We often think of hip-hop as a quintessentially, in good imperialist terms, American form, even East Coast, although, of course, people on the West Coast might object to that. I'm from the East Coast. But you first began to be interested in studying hip hop as it took rise. You first participated in hip hop culture in Paris, and you studied it there. So can you say something about the hip hop scene in Paris?
Yeah, the history of hip hop and rap in France and in Paris in particular, like everything else, like everywhere else in the world, outside of New York and the United States, really begins with the commercialization of hip hop and rap. So in the late 70s with the hit Rapper's Delight by the Sugar Hill Gang in 1979. And the fact that this song was a hit internationally, really speaks, like you were saying, to the American world dominance, right? Which translates into the sort of cultural imperialism and, just U.S. popular culture being commercialized all over the world. So in Paris or France, rap arrives in 1979 through that record. Rapper's Delight by the Sugar Hill Gang. And it's a huge hit. And the music industry in France is going to jump on this new sound and treat it as a novelty, as a trend, as a fad. And Karim Amou, in his book, L'Histoire du Rap en France, shows that the first records with rap produced in France were completely disconnected from hip hop culture. And so, because, in the United States, we can say that hip hop first emerged from local communities and then was appropriated by the music industry. And in France, it's kind of the opposite. It's, it arrived from the US through the music industry and then was appropriated by local communities. So in the early 80s, local communities in Paris and the rest of France started identifying with the culture of hip hop and connected with hip hop as a Black American culture and Black American history, because, in France, there's a lot of West Indians from Martinique, Guadeloupe, Africans from Senegal, Côte d'Ivoire, Congo, Guinea, and also North Africans, Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria, and who for a large part are living in the banlieues, so the peripheries of Paris, which are socially marginalized neighborhood in continuation with the racial order of the former French colonies. So through hip hop, there was connecting with hip hop was sort of a Pan-African connection and identification with Black Americans' experiences and history through music and through culture. So that hip hop in France could, give a voice to post-colonial communities in France, and it created a space to make their presence visible in France, a country that's thinking of itself as a colorblind country, and just help imagine France through a racial lens, So that's pretty important in terms of just thinking about race in French hip hop. I think was really important.
Right, and that connection between music and space is really interesting and important. I should just tell our listeners that in addition to writing extensively on hip hop, you also have written extensively on electronic music, and you have written an article whose title is "The Banlieue is the New Cool." So what's that about?
So that was a little bit different because he was dealing with electronic dance music scenes in Paris in the 2010s, so like later in history. And so this particular scene in the 2010s in Paris became very close to power structure, like the city power structure. And it's really interesting because usually in Paris, the whole history of Paris, like cultural activity, musical activity was really going on inside of Paris. And in the 2010s, a lot of activity started happening outside of Paris in those banlieues, those neighborhoods that are.
That wasn't true about hip hop culture from 1979?
The people who were involved in those, in the hip hop scene in Paris were living in the banlieue, but the hip hop activity was happening inside of Paris, because Paris is kind of this cultural. That's where the cultural activity is happening, and the banlieue is this socially marginalized cultural void, and so in order to have access to any, even just like room, people were coming inside Paris, taking the train from the banlieue to Paris. But with electronic dance music, it was a little bit different because it is almost the opposite. It's when Paris, because it's becoming so saturated that it has to extend, and it has to extend towards the banlieue. So now the banlieue is getting gentrified because it's cheaper, because there's space. It's different. So it's also cool for Parisians to move outside of Paris and go to the banlieue. And electronic dance music in the 2010s, the collectives that were, again, the opposite, they were coming from Paris, but going outside to the banlieue. They were supported by the government of Paris to do this cultural activity in the banlieue, to kind of prepare for gentrification and for the development of different industries for middle class to move from Paris to the banlieue.
And that development, if I recall correctly, also was part of the transformation, as you describe it, of Paris from a kind of sleepy night scene to a very vibrant and active one, especially in terms of music. Is that the trajectory that you have seen? And I'm curious to know, before we shift our attention to Los Angeles, where is Paris today as a music scene?
It's pretty vibrant. And I think the whole reason behind Paris investing in its nightlife and investing in the musical culture, local musical culture and musical activity, was that they realized that music culture was tied to tourism. And they saw that in London, and they saw that in Berlin and in Barcelona. Those cities were very successful in bringing a lot of tourism and a lot of money because of their nightlife activity. So when Paris realized that, the government of Paris realized that, that's when they started supporting nightlife in Paris, so that they could attract more tourists and attract more, younger crowds to visit Paris, so that Paris wouldn't only be known for, the Louvre and the Champs-Élysées, and just like the kind of like more traditional reason why people visit Paris.
And, one of the things that you have been concerned with and you've called for is the decolonization of music, and sort of the expansion of that very narrow white understanding of what music is. Where do you think the process of decolonization is in Paris and in France in general? Like, are we still, at the very, very beginning, or have we advanced beyond that?
I think that Paris and France is just barely waking up from like kind of a colonial dream or nightmare, because I think that, again, like France and mainland France, has been thinking of itself as a white country. And with that, it's in total denial of its past and just like its responsibility, and for a large part, like creating the African diaspora, like the Francophone French diaspora, at least, and the reason why there's so many West Indian communities and African communities and North African communities in France is because of the post-colonial ties that France has with its former colonies. So there's a reason for that, and also, France loves to think of itself as this great country with all this art and history and culture. A lot of it, was built on the free labor of, colonial subjects who, racialized people in France now are the descendants of, and they're not being really recognized as being French or having contributed to what France and French culture and French history is. So I think France is barely starting to recognize that it's not a white country, the history is not white, and that it has to include, it just has to expand the way it's thinking about itself in its history.
And I'm curious, my final question before we turn to LA. When, where did you encounter Fanon and Césaire and Senghor and the discourse of negritude?
I think probably when I was a teenager, I would have to say, because it's not taught in school in France. I mean, maybe now I don't even think it's taught in school now. But again, like I was familiar with African American history and culture before I was familiar with my own history. Um, so even from Spain, maybe I started becoming aware of who he was, but it's really, coming here in the United States that I realized how important he was, and even not just his scholarship, but also his influence for, Black radical movements, and in particular the Black Panthers, and realizing that somebody from Martinique that I barely heard of, had such an influence for the Black Panthers, which is so influential, was really, really crazy for me.
All right, so you come to the United States, I think you said in 2012. 4 years after that, you publish a book, your first book, which is actually on electronic music in Los Angeles. And then you begin to write a dissertation, the sort of reverse of the usual process. You write a book and then you do a dissertation. And then you seem to turn your focus back to what you had practiced as a kid, which is you begin to really study intensely hip hop in Los Angeles. I'm just curious about that series of transitions from Paris to Los Angeles, from electronic music to hip hop. Why and what was that like?
I think in terms of electronic dance music and hip hop, they tend to be thought as separate and different, but historically they're actually like very close, because a large part of electronic dance music, from Detroit techno and Chicago house, comes from the one song, the Africa Bombata song, Planet Rock, kind of starts from there. And then hip hop, so from this song, and then the influence, of course, of dance music, disco and funk, which also are fundamental influences for hip hop. So hip hop and electronic dance music kind of come from the same places. It's just that I think they culturally and historically they came to occupy very different spaces in terms of our consciousness, but in terms of history, they come from very, very similar places.
So what interests you as a scholar about hip hop in Los Angeles? What are your questions?
When I started being interested in music in Los Angeles, electronic dance music in relationship to hip hop, it was I was interested in the relationship between music and space, and because music plays a role in how we imagine cities, and in particular how we imagine Los Angeles. And according to different eras and different music scenes and genres, music can produce a mythology of the city. And for example, in LA, you think of surf rock and the Beach Boys. It's kind of associating to a very beach imaginary of Los Angeles, like in the early 60s. And later in the 1960s, with groups like The Doors or Janis Joplin, the sound of psychedelic rock was associated to Woodstock and counterculture and the hippie movement. So very strong mythical narratives about the city that certain sounds are connected to. And for hip hop, gangster rap is another one of those sounds that created a very mythical imaginary of the city in the late 80s and early 1990s, a sound associated with the Black neighborhoods in Los Angeles, South Central, Compton, Watts, and associated with the war on drugs, police brutality, and gangs. And if those sounds, can trigger a strong imaginary of Los Angeles. They are very strong because they have been invested by the music industry and Hollywood, who has tended to use those sounds and those narratives in a very general way, so that we kind of losing nuance and also erasing other sounds and other scenes that are telling other stories about Los Angeles. And that's what I wanted to do by focusing on electronic dance music. I wanted to look at electronic dance music in the context of Los Angeles, which usually electronic dance music is associated with Detroit, because of techno, or Chicago because of house, or New York because of garage or disco. But Los Angeles also has a pretty deep history in terms of electronic dance music, especially, and that's directly connected to hip hop, with groups and artists like Egyptian Lover, the Arabian Prince, or the World Class Wrecking Crew, which was Dr. Dre's first group. So by looking at those different scenes and this history of electronic dance music, I was trying to critique the dominant narratives about the city and imagine more complex ways of understanding the city through music.
You alluded just a minute ago to Hollywood and the music industry, which pushes to the fore one of the main features of music in its 21st century context in the United States, which is music as a capitalist enterprise. And you've also talked a lot in our conversation about music as a political act. And I'm wondering how you see this very complicated intersection between the capitalist features of music and the political features of music. And how does the music you study, both hip hop and electronic dance, and particularly Black musical art forms, how do they operate at the juncture of these two very powerful forces?
Right. I think before jumping into that, especially when talking about hip hop, we have to think about the complexity and the contradiction and the ambiguity that comes with hip hop, especially, it's this year is 2023, so it's the 50-year anniversary of hip hop culture. It's 50 years of hip hop, so it's a long time and it's a wide history. So a lot has happened, and it's difficult to talk about hip hop in general terms. So, because depending on what era we're going to be talking about, or even one artist, it's going to be pretty different dynamics and context. Like it's Public Enemy, it's also NWA, and it's also Two Live Crew. There's Missy Elliott, 50 Cent, 3 6 Mafia, Gangs. I mean, I could go on and on, right? Lil Uzi Vert, Kendrick Lamar, Future. So yeah, so there's so much hip hop, and I think that oftentimes there's a certain kind of expectations with hip hop, or we demand hip hop to be sort of a pure cultural object, and usually, demanding hip hop to be explicitly a political art form, and it's only going to be considered hip hop if it's explicitly political. But that's a part of hip hop, of course. But if it's just about having fun or talking trash or booty shaking music, that's also hip hop, and that's okay. Especially, in a world marked and defined by anti-Blackness, anything that's related to the Black experience is grounded in or marked by anti-Blackness. So anything related to the Black experience is already political. And I remember one of my students last year in a class that we were teaching with Chuck D of Public Enemy last year at UCLA. One student told me that he was saying that I love Kendrick Lamar, and but sometimes I don't want to think too hard about the state of the world. Sometimes I just want to vibe. So it's also considering that the listeners themselves are perfectly equipped to deal with the complexities of hip hop. And in terms of the music industry being this capitalist beast, and hip hop, being resistant art form, I mean, we're all living in capitalist society. So even as scholars, like talking and researching social justice in the context of the university, which itself is a pretty, capitalist beast, we also are dealing with the same contradictions or ambiguities. So I think everybody on their levels is dealing with these complexities, and sometimes I think it's not fair to ask rappers to answer to them,
Yes, I do understand. I do want to ask you another difficult question as a concluding question, which really asks you to take a glance at the longue durée, the long duration, maybe the 50-year period of the history of hip-hop, maybe longer. You mentioned the important role of music in the struggle against anti-Black racism. And I wonder whether you see the arc of history bending toward justice in any meaningful way. And if not, what therefore is the role of music in that struggle?
I think Angela Davis say something like, political struggle is not about winning. It's about, sometimes it's about winning, but it's about the struggle. It's about constantly fighting for our rights and for justice so that we can move towards justice. And I think, hip hop, a lot of times we emphasize on the explicit political aspect of hip hop, which is fine, but there's also, hip hop as for 50 years now has provided just beautiful music, and has been the background for fun times, and that in itself is political, because the fact that those past 50 years, and especially hip hop coming from a space of abandonment and deprivation and oppression in Black communities, the fact that those communities were able to create a culture that provided fun, pleasure, focus, and opportunities, and political criticism is itself, political. And hip hop as a cultural tool to transform the ghetto as not just a place of containment and oppression, but also as a place of community and as a place of belonging, like Gay Teresa Johnson says with her concept of spatial entitlement, speaks volume of the force of hip hop to transform the world on a daily, just by providing sounds that we can connect with.
On that note, we're going to have to conclude. There's much more to be said and discussed, and I look forward to that opportunity. But I do want to thank Dr. Samuel Lamontagne, who is the Chancellor's postdoctoral fellow in the UCLA Department of History and the Ralph Bunche Center, for really illuminating and interesting conversation filled with important and trenchant observations about hip-hop, electronic dance music in Paris and Los Angeles, and music in the world more generally. Thank you so much for being with us, Sam.
Thank you, David.
Thank you for listening to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. You can learn more about our work or share your thoughts with us at our website, luskincenter.history.ucla.edu. Our show is produced by David Myers and Rosalind Campbell, with original music by Daniel Reichman. Special thanks to the UCLA History Department for its support, and thanks to you for listening.